Silence surrounded Eddie Van Halen for decades. But now at 70, Michael Anthony is done protecting the myth. What he reveals isn't a rumor, a tabloid whisper, or a recycled feud. It's the side of Van Halen fans were never meant to hear, raw, personal, and long buried. Keep calm to listen to Michael Anani's shocking revelations. We all know that Michael Anthony joined Van Halen in 1974 and quickly became an essential pillar of the band's identity, remaining a full-time member for more than 3 decades until 2006. As the group's bassist and primary backing vocalist, Anthony played a crucial role in shaping the sound that would propel Van Halen from a hard-working Southern California club act into one of the most successful rock bands in history. His steady basslines, thunderous live presence, and unmistakable high harmonies helped define the band's classic era and gave their music a depth that went far beyond Eddie Van Halen's revolutionary guitar work alone. From the earliest days, Michael Anani's musicianship provided a solid rhythmic foundation that allowed Eddie Van Halen's guitar virtuosity to soar. While his bass parts were often understated, they were precise, powerful, and perfectly locked in with Alex Van Halen's drumming, forming one of rock's tightest rhythm sections. This balance was especially evident on early albums like Van Halen, Van Halen 2, and Women and Children First, where Anani's bass supported the band's aggressive yet melodic sound without ever overpowering it. Equally important was Anani's role as Van Halen's vocal backbone. His soaring backing vocals and harmonies became a signature element of the band's sound, particularly during the David Lee Roth era. Songs such as Running with the Devil, Dance the Night Away, and later hits with Sammy Hagar relied heavily on Anani's ability to add clarity, power, and polish to the band's vocal arrangements. Many fans and critics have noted that his harmonies were a defining feature that helped Van Halen stand apart from other hard rock acts of the time. Throughout the band's rise to global fame in the late 1970s and 1980s, Michael Anthony was known not only for his musical reliability, but also for his professionalism and easygoing personality. He often acted as a stabilizing force during periods of internal tension, maintaining strong personal and working relationships with Eddie Van Halen and the rest of the band. His camaraderie contributed to the band's longevity even as Van Halen navigated lineup changes, creative shifts, and intense pressures from fame and touring. However, in 2006, Michael Anani's long and defining tenure with Van Halen came to an end when he was replaced on bass by Wolfgang Van Halen, the teenage son of guitarist Eddie Van Halen. The change marked a significant turning point in the band's history, closing the chapter on one of the most stable lineup elements Van Halen had maintained since its earliest days. After more than 30 years as the group's bassist and primary backing vocalist, Anthony was no longer part of the band's active lineup, a decision that surprised many fans given his deep association with Van Halen's classic sound. The replacement became official as Van Halen prepared for its highly anticipated reunion with original frontman David Lee Roth. Rather than bringing Michael Anthony back into the fold, Eddie Van Halen chose to introduce his son Wolfgang as the band's new bassist. At just 15 years old at the time, Wolfgang's inclusion signaled both a generational shift and a more family-centered direction for the group. His debut with the band occurred during rehearsals and public appearances leading up to the 2007 to 2008 Van Halen reunion tour, confirming that Anani's role had effectively been filled. Michael Anthony himself did not issue a dramatic or detailed public statement about the circumstances of his departure, nor did he openly accuse any band member of personal wrongdoing in major interviews at the time. Instead, his comments remained measured and relatively restrained, focusing on the facts rather than speculation. It was widely understood, however, that Anthony was not invited to participate in the reunion, and the decision rested primarily with Eddie Van Halen. The absence of a clear public reconciliation or explanation left many longtime fans sensing unresolved tensions behind the scenes. The lineup change also had musical implications. Anani's backing vocals, which had been a crucial component of Van Halen's sound for decades, were notably absent following his departure. While Wolfgang proved himself a capable musician and eventually earned respect in his own right, the contrast between the classic lineup and the new configuration was unmistakable to audiences familiar with the band's earlier eras. Although the replacement itself is undisputed, The emotional and professional undercurrents surrounding Michael Anani's exit were never fully addressed publicly by all parties involved. This lack of closure has continued to shape discussions about Van Halen's internal dynamics in later years, providing important context for Anani's subsequent reflections on his time with the band and the lingering sense that his departure marked more than just a routine lineup change. In January 2021, Michael Anthony offered one of his most candid reflections on his fractured relationship with Eddie Van Halen, revealing that the two had never reconciled before Eddie's death in October 2020. Speaking on the Talking Rock with Meltdown podcast, Anthony confirmed that he and Eddie had not spoken for many years, leaving long-standing personal and professional issues unresolved. Rather than framing the situation with anger or bitterness, Anani's tone was subdued and reflective, underscoring a sense of lingering regret rather than public grievance. Anthony explained that the lack of closure kind of bothers him, acknowledging that there were some issues that were never resolved between them. While he did not go into explicit detail about the nature of those issues, the admission carried significant emotional weight, particularly given their decades-long history together in Van Halen. For fans who had long speculated about tensions following Anani's departure from the band, his comments confirmed that the distance between him and Eddie was real and enduring, not merely a temporary fallout. What seemed to trouble Anthony most was the finality of the situation. Eddie Van Halen's passing closed the door on any chance for reconciliation, leaving Anthony to reflect on what might have been said or settled had circumstances been different. He made it clear that despite the years of silence, he had hoped there would eventually be an opportunity to clear the air. That opportunity never came, and the absence of resolution became a quiet but persistent source of disappointment. Anthony also revealed that there had been discussions at various points about a possible reunion involving him and Van Halen, talks that ultimately went nowhere. The fact that such conversations occurred suggested that a path toward reconnection, however tentative, once existed. When those plans failed to materialize, it only deepened Anani's sense of unfinished business, reinforcing the idea that the relationship ended not with closure, but with unanswered questions. In the same January 2021 appearance on the Talk and Rock with Me Meltdown podcast, Michael Anthony offered rare insight into how Eddie Van Halen handled his long and difficult battle with cancer, emphasizing just how private Eddie remained even with people who had known him for decades. According to Anthony, Eddie was very private about how ill he was, a trait that defined the way he navigated his health struggles during the final years of his life. While Eddie's cancer diagnosis was widely known within the music world, the severity and progression of his condition were not openly discussed, even among close friends and former bandmates. Anthony explained that those around Eddie were aware he was sick, but they did not understand how serious the situation had become. He noted that we all knew he was ill. Yet, the announcement of Eddie's death in October 2020 still came as a profound shock. This reaction underscored how successfully Eddie had kept the full reality of his condition out of public view, choosing discretion over transparency, even as his health declined. For Anthony, the news was not only devastating, but also jarring, revealing that the truth had been far more severe than anyone realized. Eddie's insistence on privacy appeared to be deeply personal rather than strategic. Anani's comments suggested that Eddie preferred to face his illness on his own terms without inviting sympathy or speculation. This approach was consistent with Eddie's long-standing discomfort with public scrutiny outside of his music. While he was famously open through his guitar playing, he remained guarded when it came to his personal life, especially matters involving vulnerability or weakness. Non-stop there, in a June 2025 interview, Michael Anthony reflected deeply on his decades-long journey with Van Halen and identified what he described as the only regret he carries from his time in the band, the way its story ultimately came to an end. Speaking with the clarity that comes from distance and hindsight, Anthony contrasted the band's triumphant peak with its quiet, unresolved conclusion. At their height, he said, Van Halen was living the dream, a fairy tale, a once-in-a-lifetime experience where massive success, creative chemistry, and global adoration all aligned. Yet for Anthony, that magical rise made the ending feel even more painful. He explained that a band of Van Halen's stature should have concluded its run in a way that matched its impact. In his words, it should have gone out with a freaking bang that shook the world, a final statement worthy of the music and legacy they built together. Instead, Anthony felt the ending came not with celebration or unity, but with silence and fragmentation. It was more like a whimper, he said, summing up the sense of unfinished business that has lingered ever since. The remark was not aimed at any single moment, but at the broader feeling that Van Halen never truly closed the circle. Anthony again addressed the unresolved personal side of that ending, reiterating that he and Eddie Van Halen never made amends before Eddie's death in 2020. He expressed continued sadness over the fact that time ran out before old tensions could be put to rest. Still, Anani's reflections were not bitter. Instead, they carried a tone of acceptance mixed with hope about what might have been possible. He suggested that had Eddie lived longer, they likely would have calmed things down and found a way to reconcile both personally and professionally. Adding to the sense of lost opportunity, Anthony revealed that Eddie later in life had been open to the idea of a full reunion tour featuring all the original members, including Anthony himself. That openness made the lack of closure even harder to accept, reinforcing Anani's belief that the band was closer to a meaningful final chapter than many people realized. For him, the regret is not about fame, money, or recognition, but about the absence of a proper farewell. In another interview conducted in 2025, Michael Anthony turned his attention to one of the most tantalizing aspects of Van Halen's legacy: the vast amount of unreleased music Eddie Van Halen left behind. Anthony revealed that there are miles of stuff recorded over the decades: ideas, demos, riffs, half-finished songs, and fully tracked performances that never made it onto official albums. According to Anthony, Eddie had a habit of recording everything in the studio, rarely letting a musical idea disappear without capturing it on tape. Anthony explained that this archive spans nearly the entire lifespan of Van Halen, from early experimentation during the band's formative years to later studio sessions long after their peak commercial success. Eddie's creativity, he said, was constant and restless. If an idea sparked, even briefly, it was recorded. That approach resulted in an enormous body of work that exists largely unheard by the public, stored away in studio vaults rather than shaped into finished releases. For fans, the implication is both thrilling and frustrating. A treasure trove exists, but much of it may remain inaccessible. Reflecting on this unseen catalog, Anthony expressed hope that Eddie's son, Wolfgang Van Halen, might one day explore the archives more deeply. As both Eddie's heir and a musician in his own right, Wolfgang is uniquely positioned to understand the significance of the material and decide what, if anything, should be shared. Anthony made it clear that his comments were not a demand or expectation, but a wish rooted in respect for Eddie's genius and a belief that some of that work deserves to be heard. At the same time, Anthony acknowledged the reality that much of the material may never surface. "There's tons of stuff that we'll probably never see," he said, recognizing that not every recording was intended for release. Some ideas were likely sketches or experiments rather than polished statements, and Eddie himself may not have wanted all of it made public. Anani's tone suggested acceptance of that fact, even as he emphasized the sheer scale of what exists. What do you think about Michael Anani's revelations about Eddie Van Halen? Leave us your comments in the section below. We hope you have found this helpful video. Don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you like it. Thank you for watching this and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.